expert in criminal justice reform, and he has really been at the forefront raising awareness about the situation of COVID-19 outbreaks in prisons. He is also an award-winning contributing writer for the Tulsa Voice, writing features on education and justice. Right now, he has been very busy working on criminal justice reform policy for the current legislative session, and he has been generous enough to take the time to talk to us today. So just want to mention, we have closed captioning available if you would like. Oops, I am also supposed to start recording this, hold on. Except it's not giving me permission. I'll send a message. Hold on.
It looks like it's recording.
It is. Oh, perfect. Good. Okay. All right. Oh, now I'm allowed to record. Let's have more than one. Okay. And so we'll have time for questions at the end. So either feel free, be brave, unmute, and we can get a little discussion going, or just put any questions in the chat and I'll read them at the end. All right. So without further ado, I give you Mr. Damion Shade.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for taking a little bit of time out of your busy week and your weekend to hear about so many issues that affect the health and well-being and equity of our state, especially in this area, particularly where I'm talking about today in the criminal justice system, and the way that that relates to both Oklahoma's healthcare system and to larger socioeconomic factors and social determinants of health that are wrapped up in so much of the outcomes and differences between zip codes and communities. So I'm going to share my screen so you all can follow along with a slideshow that I have. And I think, I believe they have the slides, so I think they'll share these out after the event is over, so anyone can kind of look into the details of them as we're going. As Rebecca said, my name is Damion Shade. I'm the Criminal Justice Policy Analyst at the Oklahoma Policy Institute. That's a fancy way of saying I look for best practices. So I look around the United States and somewhat even other Western industrialized nations to look at policies around the incarceral system, policies around courts, and policies around all of sort of the spectrum of things that lead people to justice involvement. What sort of drags people in and out of the system? That's really sort of keenly what I focus on. The Oklahoma Policy Institute, if you don't know about it, this is an older picture, so we have a few different folks on staff now, but we're a nonpartisan, independent 501c3 policy think tank that started in 2008. We work to advance equitable, fiscally responsible policies to lead to expanded opportunity to all Oklahomans. The idea is we want an Oklahoma where everyone has a fair shot. And so much of our work is really focused on uncovering the data that sort of tells a story about how we can get more Oklahomans to that fair shot. So today I will really be focused on three things, kind of three stories that I hope to tell today. Oklahoma's prison crisis, I'll do a brief, just here's where things have been the past few years. How budget failures contributed to Oklahoma's incarceration rate, and then solutions to some of Oklahoma's racial and criminal justice problems. So on that first piece, this is a slide. This is actually a slide from when I first started my work at OK Policy, 2017, 2018. In 2016, Oklahoma became the prison capital of the world officially. It took a little while because of the way the Bureau of Justice and Uniform Crime Reporting data is reported into the system for us to know this. So we didn't officially know this until 2017, 2018, but most academics in the criminal justice space suspected that Oklahoma was on the trajectory to leading the world in per capita incarceration. The reason I show this chart, because I think it's really important to recognize a distinction. Oklahoma's not a country, right? We're just a tiny state, barely, just 4 million people. But if you put us on a chart, sort of measuring the ratio of the incarcerated population to the rest of the population, with other NATO nations, these are wealthy, Western industrialized nations, you begin to see a pattern that is kind of bananas. Like there's, to use a technical term, it's kind of bananas. You see that on that chart, Oklahoma has a higher incarceration rate, not only than the other 10 NATO nations that you see on this list, but even the United States. We had a higher per capita incarceration rate than the entire nation at the time. This incarceration rate includes our jail incarceration. So I'll show you an imprisonment / incarceration with county jail back up in just a moment, and you'll see a different number. Just that's where the distinction comes in. This counts our county jail, pretrial incarceration, as well as our state prison population. And if you were to put Saudi Arabia and China, terrible regressive nations, on this list and account for political prisoners, just subtract the political prisoners, just the actual incarceral state in China and Saudi Arabia, Oklahoma and the United States, of course, would be higher than both of those places, which is not a good distinction. One of the other remarkable facts that I definitely want to point out about this chart really quick is that we have the highest female incarceration rate in the nation, and by virtue of that, the world, and have maintained that since 1991. Our female incarceration rate is actually more than 1,000 times higher than the per capita female incarceration rate in Thailand. Just to give you an example of how poorly calibrated Oklahoma's incarceral system is to the size of its population. So what did we see in 2016? In 2016 in Oklahoma, we saw a criminal justice coalition began to form. This is a picture. You see the former director of the ACLU of Oklahoma, Ryan Kietzel here. You see the current director of Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform, some folks from the business community and the faith community as well surrounding them. And State Question 780, which I'm sure some of you have heard of, was one of the most profound criminal justice reforms probably in Oklahoma history. Remarkably, on the same night that Donald Trump became president of the United States and he won 77 counties in this state of Oklahoma, on that same night, Oklahoma actually passed one of the most forward-thinking criminal justice reforms in the nation, defelonizing simple drug possession and a number of related crimes, with the goal being to say, if you are a person struggling with addiction, if you are a person who could be better served by a hospital than you could be served by a prison cell or a jail cell, you shouldn't go to prison. We need to be investing money in mental health treatment and substance use treatment that helps people struggling with addiction actually get out and make their lives better, and not just, relegating them to what I call prisons, the sociological wastebasket, this place where any problems that our public policy environment has not given us the ability to solve them directly, we sort of throw in prisons and we throw in jails, or we throw to the police and law enforcement structure, to tell them to fix them. 2016 was really the beginning of a consistent path that we've seen since 2016, where the goal of voters has been really clear. Voters decided in 2016, if you're struggling with addiction, you should not be going to prison as the primary way to fix whatever's going wrong with you. In 2017, 2018, actually, we voted for the decriminalization of medical marijuana, right? And now Oklahoma is lovingly referred to as Toklahoma in popular news stories. This super conservative state where medical marijuana has become a massive and growing industry. Voters have sort of made their will known in those ways. And that's really a dynamic that's important to point out. And the thing that of course, the naysayers of these movements have all said the same thing, that by reducing Oklahoma's incarceration, we would begin to see a precipitous increase of crime. But we have actually seen precisely the opposite of that. If you look at this time period, when we start to see criminal justice reforms really taking into effect, especially after 2016, we have consistently seen drops in violent crime, significant reductions in nonviolent crime, significant reductions in the rate of arrest, significant reductions in the rate of reported crime. If you look at the felony filings and the misdemeanor filings, even the reports of crime have actually gone down at exactly the same time that we've seen some of the most significant justice reforms in the history of Oklahoma. This is a really important data fact that I hope you'll hang on through this presentation. So what's the status of things now? 2020 is obviously a bad year for us to attempt to draw a data baseline for the incarceral system. We saw significant changes to the way jails detained people and the way they sent people to and from state prisons. We saw significant changes to the state prison, not in just its intakes, but in the way and the timing in which people were put onto parole or other forms of community supervision. So 2019 is really our best data proxy right now, until we're able to get some baseline now that trials and other procedures have started to resume on a normal basis again in 2021. As we can see, Oklahoma has fallen to the third highest per capita incarceration rate in the United States, which, as you can see, this list shows the imprisonment with county jail backup. So it doesn't have pretrial detention. That's why the number is so much smaller per 100,000 than in the other graph. And so this shows you that we have made some positive progress. We've seen about a 17% reduction in our state prison population in the last 3 years, which is fairly remarkable. Much of that is due to the criminal justice reforms that I discussed earlier, reforms that were also passed under the Fallon administration, and then some reforms from that time period that have kicked in the beginning of Governor Stitt's administration. Of course, I'm sure many of you saw last year, Oklahoma had the largest single-day commutation in American history, with about 500 folks getting out, all in a one-day commutation. This is a direct result of State Question 780, which voters passed in 2016 on the same day that Donald Trump was elected. So the interesting thing to note about this is I don't celebrate this. It is a happy thing that Oklahoma no longer leads the nation in per capita incarceration, but we are, for statistical purposes, basically in a tie with the other two states that have some of the worst incarceral outcomes. The other issue here is that if any of these states, and some of these states have already started to make reforms to their system, if any of these states make significant reforms to probation, parole, drug crime laws, Oklahoma will be the prison capital of the world again if we don't do more to try and continue the positive trajectory that the last 5 to 7 years have seen in this state. So there is a racial component to this that I would be remiss to not speak of in detail, because the nature of Oklahoma's incarceral system, you really cannot understand the incarceration disparities unless you look through the prism of race. And the incarceration rate for white Oklahomans has been roughly analogous with the incarceration rate for the national average for the last 20 years. It is only when you look at communities of color that you see the disparity that turns Oklahoma into such an outlier actor in the data. So as this shows, Black Oklahomans are 5 times more likely to be incarcerated than white Oklahomans. Folks who look like me, adult Black men, every 1 in 20 of us is incarcerated in this state. For Latinx or American Indians, people of those descents, they're more than 3 times likely to be incarcerated than white Oklahomans. And this disparity becomes even more stark with women when we see a disparity that's more than 3 times high for American Indian and Native women who are in the state of Oklahoma, kind of giving you a little bit of a window into why Oklahoma has such a stratospheric female incarceration rate. So much of that is pointed at Black and women of American Indian descent by policies that we'll get into a little more detail about in just a moment. So the last piece of the incarceral picture in Oklahoma is this, and it's one of those facts that when you look at it, it just looks bizarre. We incarcerate 67% more people over the age of 60 to 64 than the national average, 72% more people over the age of 65 than the national average. And the reason for this is complicated, but the easiest piece is Oklahoma's sentencing laws. Oklahomans are sentenced 70% longer for nonviolent property crimes than the national average, and they are sentenced for 79% longer for nonviolent drug crimes than the national average. This means that we have people who are 70, 80 years old sitting in prison on nonviolent drug offenses that they probably would have either gotten misdemeanor sentences, meaning they wouldn't have gone to prison, they would have only gone to a county jail, or that they would have gotten a significantly lighter sentence under the current statutory framework for law. This means our prisons are filled with people who are significantly older. And this has significant impacts on the next piece of this puzzle that we're going to discuss. So COVID-19 in Oklahoma prisons. I had a debate with one of my coworkers that I think is sort of illustrative of how healthcare intersects with this system. One of my colleagues runs our Open Justice Oklahoma program, which is where a lot of our data comes from. They use amazing data scraping tools that are coded with the programming language R to scrape the Oklahoma court system and actually get that open source data and analyze it. Ryan was of the belief that when the pandemic started, we would seriously have to watch Oklahoma prisons because we saw a pattern in many state prison systems across the US where there would be a large number of infected people and the prison system would do what it could to hide that. And as long as those were asymptomatic carriers, some prisons and some jails were really successful in hiding it. They were able to hide it until they had hospitalizations, until they had deaths, until there was something that could draw the attention of the public. Most people didn't realize what was going on in prisons. And my colleague believed that Oklahoma would be in a similar situation. I doubted this a great deal. One, because of the last slide, the fact that we incarcerate so many people over the age of 65, but also because of a unique problem that Oklahoma has had for the last decade. The Medicaid coverage gap. This shows you this unique space that has existed in the state of Oklahoma for the last 10 years. The lowest income people in the state of Oklahoma have had some of the least secure access to healthcare in the United States for the last decade. By our estimates, there's something like 200,000 to 300,000 people who either in the mental health space or the primary care physician space are undercovered because Oklahoma has failed to expand Medicaid. Now, fortunately, in 2020, we expanded Medicaid through State Question 802. Now the legislature is in the process of working out with the governor how they're going to fund that. If that's an issue that you care about and want to learn more about, please follow OK Policy and delve into more of our healthcare work and sort of the debate over managed care. That's not my expertise, not my space, but it definitely has a huge impact on the picture of this. We can see this really clearly in a few places. So Oklahoma ranks 7th with the share of adults with heart disease, right? It's not the worst statistic in the world, but we rank 1st in the rate of deaths due to heart disease. Why is this? And we actually see this picture with diabetes, with a number of chronic illness because of the absence of access to primary care. So people in prisons and jails tend to be the lowest income people in our society. So you're talking about people who don't have enough money to afford an attorney, people who often don't have enough money to bail out, people who fit what lawyers call the indigence criterion for needing relief from the state to even be involved in the court system. And so those are the people who are also the least likely to have access to the medicine they need, the primary care physician they need, the preventative care and the preemptive treatments that they need. Those are the people most likely to delay medical treatment for fear of the financial cost. And so we see Oklahoma having the second highest uninsured rate in the United States is a direct result of the state's failure to expand Medicaid. We look at the states that are on this list, many of them are late expanders and many of them are states that have not had targeted programs to help their lowest income citizens in that process. So we see that disparity mirrors as well the disparity that we see in incarceration rates to a remarkable extent, right? The people with the least access to healthcare are the people who are most wrapped up in our incarceral system. Part of that is the mental health gap. If a community has less access to substance use treatment, has less access to inpatient mental health beds, that community is going to, by almost necessity, have to utilize more jails. When they have people who are struggling with issues of mental health crisis, when they have people who are struggling with substance use and addiction, they send police to deal with those issues, and police utilize the tools that we give them. So in the communities where most of these people live, there's less access, and you can sort of see a mirror in these data sets and the way that these problems impact the community's health. And so what we saw in the state of Oklahoma when COVID-19 really began to hit our prisons, there was no ability to hide it. There were too many older people with comorbidities, with hepatitis C that is ravaging our prisons, with a number of pre-existing conditions that made them acutely vulnerable to this pandemic. So prisons couldn't hide it. Once it got in the prisons, it was like clockwork. The second there were cases and we started getting calls from moms and dads who were terrified what was going on with their kids, and that no news stories were covering it, it'd be about a week and a half later that there would be a news story about hospitalizations, tragically in some cases death, and terrible outcomes happening at that prison because the prison population of Oklahoma is too unwell. That prison population cannot absorb a pandemic, nor should it have to. But we are particularly vulnerable in this state because of the healthcare system that is attached to our incarceral system. And we sort of see the overlap here. The good news about this is that bipartisan coalitions can really save lives. We were part of a coalition that involved conservative groups like Americans for Prosperity and super progressive groups like the ACLU of Oklahoma, calling for rational common sense data metrics, rational common sense reforms, simple things like providing tests for every guard in the Department of Corrections who goes in and out of those buildings every day. And I pointed out to many lawmakers, you may not care about these prisons and the inmates and the people who are experiencing these terrible situations. Certainly you care about the guards, and certainly you care about the medical staff who walk in and out of those buildings, particularly because most of the guards live in rural Oklahoma. So if they walk out of a prison with COVID-19, they walk that COVID-19 into their rural community. Their kids walk that infection into rural schools. If they end up having to be hospitalized, it is a rural hospital that will deal with that. And so we've already seen in the state of Oklahoma in multiple counties, prison and jail outbreaks leading to super spread events because the guards were not tested, because there weren't rational criterion to make sure that just good standards of public safety were held. And so one of the things I'm most proud of in our work from last year is that mask mandates, masks were donated and PPE for every inmate in the Department of Corrections, as well as access to soap and water, which is not something that prisoners have regular access to, access to testing for all of the guards and for inmates who were suspected of illness, new quarantine procedures. They created a data system. The Oklahoma Department of Corrections did some positive things. Oklahoma was not ranked well in our COVID response. I believe we got a D+ from the Prison Policy Initiative for our COVID response, but it really was bipartisan coalitions of Oklahoma voters and advocates who cared about this issue that gave us the wins that we were able to receive. So the piece of this that Oklahoma policy has really most focused on for the last 10 years of us really deeply doing this work is how budget failures contribute to this picture, to Oklahoma being one of the highest incarceration states of the US. And this intersects well with the healthcare conversation in a number of ways. So this picture, which anybody who's my age or older probably remembers well, because I imagine you were going into college around the time when this terrible economic cataclysm hit the United States. But this is a picture of Wall Street traders in 2007 during the start of the Great Recession. Many people don't remember, but at the beginning of the Great Recession, the United States was losing 500,000 jobs a month. 500,000 jobs a month, massive trillions and trillions of dollars of equity and wealth for homeowners disappearing, a cataclysm that we haven't seen anything like until right now. The COVID-19 crisis is the closest in our lifetime to the economic calamity that happened just a little more than a decade ago. How does that relate to this issue? What this did was change state budget pictures. We forget that in low tax states like Oklahoma, right? Everything is about the revenue that is generated by our sales tax on the municipal level and by very, very large, usually fossil fuel interests. So when oil prices go down, as we know right now, we have massive budget failures. And this happened across the United States in lower tax states particularly, but in states that are super dependent on fossil fuels, this was an acute problem. And Texas, for example, dealt with the same issue as us. And they also had to have a prison system and had a prison system at the time that was exploding and moving out of control. So here's what happened. All of these conservatives in these low tax states had taken a pledge that they would never raise taxes. So they were confronted with this terrible budget failure. And they said, by the way, we've got to spend millions, hundreds of millions, or billions of dollars building new prisons because we got too many people in these prisons and they're growing at a rate we have to build them. And, you know, the leaders in the state said, well, we can't do that. We don't have billions of dollars. How do we deal with this? And, you know, someone in the room, I'm sure, said, well, we could raise taxes. And that person was fired and told to never return. And the other people in the room said, hey, I don't know who that guy was. Sorry he got in here. But someone in the room said, there are states that are doing this weird thing called criminal justice reform. They are investing in treatment, in mental health options, investing in things other than prisons and jails. And it's saving them millions and millions of dollars, and they're not having to build new prisons, and they're not having to raise taxes. And somebody said, well, are these, what states? California? Like, I don't care about California. They're like, no. Conservative states like Kentucky, because Kentucky was doing it at the time because they were desperate, like many of these other states, to find a solution for their budget problem. And so Texas said, well, shoot, if conservatives in Kentucky are doing it, we're doing it too. And from 2007 to 2017, the state of Texas closed 8 prisons, releasing more than 10,000 people from their carceral system, saving their voters billions, literally billions of dollars in saved incarceration costs. This created a new dynamic. And this is kind of the one piece of this that I think most Americans have a little bit of. They saw that, you know, for those people who were doing financial crimes and stealing things on Wall Street, there was really no incarceral penalty. And people understood that for people, you know, possessing marijuana, there are still people incarcerated in the state of Oklahoma for nonviolent marijuana-related crimes for the rest of their lives. There are people who will be incarcerated for the rest of their lives for nonviolent marijuana crimes right now. And most Oklahomans don't recognize that's a thing. But it is still a thing, even though we've got, medical marijuana dispensaries in every little rural town you can think of. That's still a thing. This is the piece that most people are aware of. But there's another piece to this sort of negative class dynamic that we see develop itself in the Oklahoma justice system. This is a chart that was made by our Open Justice Oklahoma, a table showing the amount of court fines and fees that were assessed to criminal defendants each year between 2012 and 2018, and the difference between that assessment and how much was actually paid. Oklahoma's court system is funded nearly 90% by fines and fees. In the criminal court system, 80% of those people funding it are the poorest people in the state. 80% of them would be defined as indigent or unable to afford an attorney. The remarkable thing that happened on the other side of that picture that I showed you of 2007, when a lot of states realized we can't afford a court system anymore, what did they do? They said, well, let's not use taxes to fund the court system. Let's use fines and fees from speeding tickets. Every speeding ticket that you've ever gotten has a whole bunch of fees on it that you have nothing to do with your driving, have nothing to do with the fact that, you broke the law, but they fund courts, they fund police actions, law libraries, all sorts of things. That's where this money comes from. Not both, in some cases, speeding tickets. This is an allotment of district courts. But every time you have a court case, whether you are innocent or guilty, there are fees associated. Every time you have an interaction with the criminal court system in Oklahoma and in much of the United States is always trying to extract wealth from you. Extract payment. We fund our court system the way Netflix is funded. We use a fee-for-service model. And again, to use my technical term, it's bananas, because the fee-for-service model doesn't even fund the courts. As you can see in this table, we collect a third of that debt. So that $663 million was supposed to fund judges and court staff and prosecutors, and not just to mention the perverse incentives of this relationship, right? Every time a judge prosecutes, or every time a judge puts that gavel down and says that, this is a conviction for this reason, they know they make more money and their staff will get more money if the sentence is longer. Every time a prosecutor prosecutes someone, they know their offices make more money if the sentence is longer. Felonies are a lot more lucrative for the court than misdemeanors. And so a big piece of what's wrong with Oklahoma is all wrapped up in this financial system. I heard a wonderful analogy the other day. We don't pay firefighters per fire, right? Or per severity of fire. There's just an inherent sort of economics lesson in there, right? Human beings respond to the economic incentives that they're given. And so I have a plaque in my office that actually says, perverse incentives produce perverse outcomes. These perverse incentives have produced these perverse outcomes. So this is a map of my city of Tulsa, or my county of Tulsa, and Tulsa County. And as you can see, in the dark red portions, the darkest red portions are the neighborhoods that have the highest amount of court debt. So that last table I showed you, these are the people in Tulsa County with the largest percentage of that, millions and millions of dollars in some of these tiny zip codes. And you will note that a little bit north of my house, like not even a mile, in the neighborhood that was known as Greenwood, the historic Black Wall Street neighborhood, and the Turley neighborhood that's just north of it, that is where the highest concentration of per capita court debt, $590 per adult in that tiny zip code. And it is a tiny population of people. And there are more failure to pay warrants in that community than anywhere else in Tulsa County. The amount of court debt in the affluent white neighborhoods and the per capita failure to pay warrants in those affluent white neighborhoods, it's not even close. Just to give you, for those who don't know, the city of Tulsa and Greenwood, North Tulsa, this is a picture I like to call Black folks flexing on the promenade circa 2017 or 1917. These are wealthy Black people in Greenwood driving around in their super fancy car for the time, flexing, just being super dope, like rich Black folks. This community was destroyed by the largest act of racial violence in American history almost exactly 100 years ago this May. Um, that act of violence, of course, as we know, was supported by police, supported by bits of the National Guard. They were bombed by planes from the sky, and that act of violence destroyed that community in ways that we continue to see the legacy of to this day. The important piece of that is how that interacts with our incarceral system. In those places where we see that high concentration of failure to pay warrants, that means they're taking you to jail because you didn't pay your court fines and fees. Or you're on probation and they're taking you back to prison. They call it revocation. They're revoking you back to prison because you didn't pay the court the money you owe, right? Like, if your Netflix bill, for example, if every time you didn't pay your Netflix bill, they could take you to prison, I bet Netflix would be a lot richer, right? Like, this is sort of the economic philosophy that undergirds the entire criminal justice system in Oklahoma. So in Tulsa, we see that some of those predominantly Black, low-income neighborhoods have reported police stops more than 100 times that of wealthy neighborhoods. Black Tulsans are 17% of the population, but we're 35% of all the people arrested, and most of the arrests are for municipal and district court cost warrants. The vast majority of warrants that police are looking for all the time are failure to pay warrants. Thousands and thousands of them, tens of thousands of them in those tiny zip codes. And so one of the things that I like to tell people about systemic racism when we talk about that expression and its intersection with the incarceral system, none of these police officers need to be personally racist. They don't need to experience emotional antipathy for anyone of another race for this data to show the disparity, because the racial wealth gap exists, right? We know those communities are more poor because of historic things that have happened in housing, that have happened in segregation laws, education disparities, and other things. So we know that pronounced piece already exists. But when you light that neighborhood up with a heat lamp of court debt and failure to pay warrants, if the police stop people more because they have a failure to pay warrant, arrest people more because of that failure to pay warrant, and those people end up detained and incarcerated more, it is only a natural consequence of that economic system that the place where all the failure to pay warrants are is where all the police will be. We've literally we've lit up neighborhoods like a heat lamp. And these neighborhoods, by the way, are the neighborhoods with the least access to mental health inpatient care, the least access to primary care physicians. And so you see that 70% of the women who are incarcerated in Oklahoma have serious mental illness and need for care. 78% of the state prison population, men and women, have severe mental illness or some substance use addiction issues that they need treatment for. And the vast majority of those people, more than 70%, never get that treatment in prison or jail. Prisons or jails do not have treatment infrastructures in Oklahoma that are meaningful or robust to any extent. So these economic systems, combined with the healthcare policy deficits, have created the crisis we've seen. The good news, and I definitely want to end with some good news, is that we have the ability, not just in the future, but even this year, in 2020 and now 2021, to do more to make a difference in these spaces, some of our criminal justice priorities. There are a bunch of bills we're tracking, but the top two that I hope everyone here will remember: House Bill 1795 and Senate Bill 704. House Bill 1795 would begin to end the terrible practice of revoking or suspending someone's driver's license for failure to pay court fines and fees. It's something that sounds like a little problem, but it actually destroys people's lives completely. Nearly 20,000 people a year in the state of Oklahoma lose their driver's license for court fines and fees that have absolutely nothing to do with driving. So we're not talking about DUIs, we're not talking about DWIs, we're talking about people who had a court case. Sometimes speeding tickets are peripherally part of that in the municipal system, but we're talking about in the district court system. It is all people who had some court case and some offense, and they had fines and fees. They got a failure to pay warrant, and because of that warrant, their driver's license was suspended. There are stories of people who have lost their jobs, lost their ability to keep their kids, to take them to and from school. And what happens in these situations? They lose their driver's license, right? But they still have to take their kids to school. So they drive their kids to school and they drive to work. They go to the places they need to go. Eventually the police stop them. They've got a suspended license. They go to jail for that. They end up with more fines and fees. Often their car is impounded. Often they lose their car. And this creates a cycle of incarceration, arrest, and rearrest that literally destroys people's lives. I know a woman who, when she was 17 years old, she made some bad decisions, got wrapped up in addiction, something I myself have struggled with in my life. I've struggled with addiction. I know what it is to be in a space where you find yourself succumbing to decisions that are not good for you and not good for your family because of the illness that has taken hold of you. This woman struggled with addiction her whole young life, and because of a series of arrests from when she was 17 to 23, she ended up with $50,000 of court fines and fees for nonviolent drug possession offenses. Every single one of her offenses, every one of them, they're nonviolent drug offenses. She is now 50. She's getting close to 50 years old, and she celebrated with her family. They are down to $10,000 of court debt. Over the last decades of her life of experiencing this terrible, terrible thing, she has repeatedly said to her probation officer, "What should I do? What bills should I not pay? Should I not feed my kids as much? Should I not pay for the medicine that I have to pay for? Should I see if my landlord will just take my rent next month so that I can pay you and keep my driver's license so I can keep driving my kids around and taking them to where they need to go, and also so I don't get taken back to jail?" That has been the defining story of her life. And House Bill 1795 is designed to attack that idea directly. Senate Bill 704 is designed to reduce Oklahoma's terrible and stratospheric sentencing. So the goal of this bill is to end the fact that Oklahoma incarcerates people 70% longer for nonviolent property crimes and 79% longer for nonviolent drug crimes than every other state in the US, the national average. This bill would end that practice by abolishing what are called sentence enhancements for most nonviolent offenses. The nice thing about this bill is it's also tied to a spending bill that would incarceration costs. It's about $137 million over 5 years, which is a lot of money, right? $137 million isn't nothing. And that amount of money would be poured specifically into victim services for women who are survivors of domestic violence. The whole goal is to create an infrastructure by which women and the victim and partners who are the victims of domestic violence can find an escape release, where they can get the resources they need, their kids can get the care they need, and get everything that they need to be able to make it. At the end of this, I put a few resources for everyone to learn a little bit more about all these pieces. Please sign up for OK Policy's weekly newsletter if you want to know more about what's happening in the state legislative system, not just criminal justice, all of the issues that we care about. And I like to end always with a quote from the first African-American congressman in US history, Sir Shirley Chisholm: "If they don't give you a seat at the table, bring a folding chair." All of these issues, you all, as young students, as concerned Oklahomans, you all have power to effectuate change on these issues. So I think we might be almost out of time, but definitely open to any questions.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. Yeah, I don't know if we're about to be kicked out of the breakout room. Does anyone have any questions right now?
I have a quick one.
Yep.
Do you know if prisoners have access to the vaccine right now? Those who meet the criteria for the phases?
Not yet. Wait, there's the ACLU has a lawsuit right now that they're pushing to get those vulnerable prisoners who are the most vulnerable on that list, and that legal action, I think it's still proceeding. I don't know what the status of it is, but inmates are not on the top list. We have been able to move staff, prison staff and law enforcement who are in the prison context have been moved higher up, but not inmates yet. That's a good question.
Okay, let's see if we can squeeze in one before we get kicked out. I like this one. Will the effects of the pandemic on incarcerated populations be a convincing argument to reduce prison populations moving forward?
I'm sad to say I don't think so. I think it is the only way that people will really recognize it if they recognize that what happens in prison doesn't stay in prison. Prison is part of an interconnected system, and obviously guards walk out every day, people walk